Hello, Programming 12. We are taking a look today at the Dungeon Crawl project, and we are going to make things dark. We're going to add in this shroud of darkness that follows around our character, and it appears that we are illuminating sort of an area as if we are holding a light, a lantern, or something like that. And of course, the further things are away from you, the darker it gets. So what's going on here? We're going to talk about that. We'll set up a list of things that you need to do to make this happen, and then I'll leave you to sort of do the thinking to make it work. So let's get started. First of all, I want to talk about what is this effect and how does it work. So to get started with it, this is actually a whole bunch of small squares that are all checking their distance to the character and adjusting their opacity based on how close or how far away they are. The closer they are, the more opaque they will become. Other way around. The more transparent they will become. The further away they are, the more solid or opaque they will become. So what's that all about? Let me show you, just to adjust things. I have a size variable. This is my main tab that I'm going to adjust. So I'm going to make it 100, just so you can see that, whoa, they're actually pretty big. And when they were size 5, they were tiny, and it almost made it look like things are a sphere, but it's just because the pixels or the cells of darkness were much smaller. So now you can see I've enhanced the size. You might be able to make out the effect. It's really just a grid of squares, and they're adjusting their transparency. They're all just filled with black, and they are adjusting their transparency based on how close they are to the character, the hero. So as I move around, their adjustment changes. This is kind of similar to the pixels that we created back in the object-oriented puzzle. Remember, with Mr. Hartley Foltz's face in the background? So if you remember that one, we were sort of using the distance to the mouse, but we made some changes and experimented with stuff. So each one of these squares is going to be an object that we're going to define a class for, and then we're going to make an array list of that class, and then we're going to lay them out in a grid fashion when we add them to these darkness cells, these squares, to the array list. And then we're going to write a loop to animate them. So it's sort of a 3-step process. So 1, we're going to make the class. We'll do some of that together. 2, we're going to make an array list of these objects, these darkness cells, I'm calling them. And we're going to lay them out in a grid when we add them. And then 3, we are going to write a loop to animate these things, and that's going to be the easiest one of all. So let's get started with step number 1. So step 1, we are going to take a look at the class. So I'm calling this class darkness cell, and I don't know, that's just the name that came to me. It represents like a single square of darkness. If you saw, like, when we made them really large, there's not that many of them, and it was a little more clear what was happening. But their size is going to be variable, as is their location. So we're going to have an opacity, and we're going to have an X and a Y and a size. You'll also notice that it does not extend to game object. So this is going to be a separate layer outside of the game. And I chose to do this because if you were checking collision, say, against, bullets or enemies or whatever it is, you don't want to also have to go through every single darkness cell. So we're actually going to have a separate list to keep track of our darkness cells and manage our darkness cells. That also means a separate loop to initialize them and a separate loop to animate them as well. So those will be some extra things to put in. So here's our opacity variable. Here's our X and Y and our size. Those are going to all be floats. So here's an example of a constructor that you can create. Our darkness cells are not going to know where they're not going to put themselves into the right place. We're going to do that in the setup, where we write the loop that creates them, in the same fashion as when we made our breakout game in Programming 11. We arranged those bricks, or whatever we call them, in some kind of grid fashion. So that's going to be your task as well. That's going to be code outside of our darkness cell. The code that lays it out in the grid, that will be in setup. All our constructor really needs to do is just position this where it's supposed to be and be a particular size. So you can see that the constructor is really nothing special. It just takes in parameters for its location and its size, and it just obeys. It just sets its instance variables to the values of the parameters. That's all. So all the planning for how to lay this out as a grid will be done external to this class. I also set opacities to some default value, but not really important what that value is because we're going to overwrite it. So that's the constructor. We also have a show function, and I'm going to leave this one like blank. I'm not going to show my answer. I want you to think about how to make this work. So the idea is that you're going to draw a square on the screen, and you can just start by drawing a square. You don't have to get the opacity thing working first. So just get it to be a square on the screen that is at the right X and Y and has the, not the correct opacity, but the right size. So it'll probably black out your screen when you put it on there. But, great, that's good. Or maybe set the opacity to some number that's like between 0 and 255, like 100. So then you can at least see through and see what's happening. But the ideal situation is you will see, or I guess you could randomize the opacity as well, a random number between 0 and 255. That'd be extra good because then you can see each individual cell. That's just to start things out, to test things. Eventually, you'll want to get rid of that, and you'll want to start calculating the correct opacity. And that's going to be based on how close you are to that square, how close my hero is. So you're probably going to be calculating the distance between the hero and this square's location as well. So you know about that already, the distance function we've used throughout this course and the previous course. So the dist function will be the one you want to use to make that measurement. And then based on that distance, you can set the opacity. I personally use the map function. So map is a really good function to use. The map function, you could say something like this. So opacity equals the map of, and then what you can do is you can map your distance. So you can put in like I'll just put d. So you can calculate d up here, like d equals distance, blah blah blah. And maybe this code won't compile, but anyways, this is the basic outline of it. So you calculate your distance, and then you can calculate your opacity based on that, because distance ranges from 0 to, and this number will depend on your code and your size of your screen. So you'll have to figure that out. What is the range? Like, what is the maximum distance you can be away from a particular square? So whatever number that is, let's say it's 100. It's not going to be 100. Then you want to map this range to a different range. So this will be the range of your opacity. So this is the range of the distance, the minimum and maximum distance you can be away, and then you'll map that to your opacity. And so the opacity ranges from 0 to 255, but that remains to be seen if this is the right order. So you might need to flip these around. You'll flip these around. I'll leave it to you to decide what is the correct way to get those in. But something like this would be great. So that's my show function. That's the basic structure of it. Of course, after you've calculated the opacity, you want to use that in your fill function and then draw your square at the right place. So that's a rough idea, some pseudocode for you to figure out what's happening in your show function. I'll leave it to you to finish it off. Now, it's hard to test the show function until you've laid out the squares on the screen in a grid formation. So again, feel free just to program this as a square at X and Y and at size, and just fill it with some number while you're testing out the next part. And then maybe solve the show function after you've got the grid laid out. So you could just leave it like this with a fill function, whatever you need to do while you're testing it. So I'm gonna again leave show alone for now, and I'm gonna go now to talk about the second part, which is the laying it out as a grid. So where is that going to happen? That's definitely going to happen in your main tab. So you'll see I have an array list of darkness cells. If you wanted to make this an array, you could. I like making an array list just because it keeps everything consistent, and I don't have to calculate how many darkness cells are going to be in there. I can just add however many I want. So I'll leave it to you to decide if you use an array or an array list. So once you have made this array list, of course, or you've declared it anyways, you have to make it using the new keyword. So somewhere along the line I do that. Yeah, here I am. Yeah, right here. So I set my darkness cell array list to be a new darkness cell array list, And now it's ready to add new darkness cells. So how do you add new darkness cells to it? Well, I mean, you can just say darkness, darkness.add new, and then you can say darkness cell, whatever the constructor is, and you could give it numbers. So, what are the numbers a darkness cell requires? Well, it needs a X, a Y, and a size. So you could just add in a few just to test it out. I could add it at 100, 100, and make a size. Well, I have a variable here so that I can sort of control the size, but whatever you want to do for that. So you can just add a few manually just to see how that works. But you don't want to depend on that ultimately. Ultimately, you're going to want to write a loop that is going to put it into a grid formation. So I actually have that already written, and I'm not going to show you because I want you to do the thinking on that to figure out how it works. I will tell you exactly how my loop works though. So basically for your loop, what I do is I create new darkness cell objects in a loop, and I basically start at a particular X and Y coordinate. I think I'm actually using rect mode corner for this. So, feel free to use rect mode center for it or corner, it doesn't matter. You can be the judge of that. You might think, oh, well, like you can notice here, like I'm equally distant from all of these squares, but I'm closer to this one because I'm using corners, and the X is this corner, and the Y is that corner of this square. So I'm like right on it. But like this square, I appear to be further away because I'm measuring my distance from there. So you might be like, no, I got to use rect mode center. And that's fine if you want. But I find that when you make the size of the square really small, it doesn't matter. Nobody's going to notice. So I found the planning was easier when I used rect mode corner. And what my loop does is they basically create a new darkness cell object, and I start off with some variables for my X and Y, and they start at like 0, 0. And then after I make that, my next line for the loop, I increase X by however big size is. So in this case, I'd move over by 100. And then I'd create a new darkness cell object here, with X being 100 greater. And then I add to 100 again on top of X. And I make a new darkness cell. And I keep on adding whatever the size is onto the darkness, or onto the variable that's keeping track of where to put it. And I'm sending those variables as parameters to the constructor of the darkness cell object. So I'm just going to go through that pattern over and over again. Eventually, I'm going to get to the end. And that's when I need to have an if statement that will catch that I'm at the end. And if I am at the end, in other words, if X is at the width of the screen or greater than the width of the screen, depending on how you've set it up, then I need to set the X variable back to the beginning and then go down or increase Y, I guess is a better way of saying that, by size, and then do it all over again. So I'll mostly be increasing X, and eventually I'll get to the end and I'll have to set X back to 0 and then go down. You could also do this with Y. You could go, down with Y, and then when I get to the bottom, I could increase X and set Y back to 0, back to the beginning, and go down this way. So there's kind of two different ways you can work on that. In order to make this work, you are going to have some planning variables, int X, int Y, and you'll probably want to start them at particular values. So for me, I'm probably going to do 0, but you can, depending on how you're doing yours, you can do it the way you want. And then I'm going to have some kind of loop, and I'll let you think about what that loop looks like, but I'm going to be passing the X and Y variables to my constructor for darkness cells, and then adding those darkness cells to the list. Also in my loop, I'm going to be increasing X, and eventually, if X gets beyond the edge, I'm going to set X back to 0 and increase Y, go down. So that's the structure of the while loop that you're going to use to plan out your darkness cell grid. And once you've done that, you're going to be ready to show those things. So again, before you get all this working, you might want to just add some random ones just to see what they look like. Whoop. And then go from there. Oh, my face has been, I'm not sure if my face is on top of that or below it, but we'll get rid of that. Okay, so that's that. The last thing for the darkness cells is actually drawing the darkness cells. So if you add them to this list, they don't actually show up. They're just in a list. So in your game function, you're going to want to write some code to loop through the darkness cell array list, or array if you chose, and show each one. So that's what my draw game objects function does. And I won't show that code because I bet you could do that. That's just a while loop or some kind of loop that will start at the beginning and go to the end. And each time it'll get a darkness cell and then show that darkness cell. It's like a really simplified version of our draw game objects loop, which tells all of our game objects to act and show, but there's no acting and there's no removal. You don't have to have an if statement to remove them if they die. So folks, that's how you're going to do the darkness cells. That's still quite a bit of work for you to do. So remember, it might be worth your time to, for your darkness cell, make a basic darkness cell that's just a square, and don't worry about the darkness increasing or decreasing. And then just maybe add a few, like just create a few and just add them in. It just can be at whatever coordinates you want. Then go over to the game, and in the game function, make them show up, right? That loop that goes through and shows them. Once you can actually see them on screen, then you can start working on the two hardest things, and that will be the darkness cell show function, so getting them to change their opacity as you move farther and closer away from them, and the grid aspect, which will be in setup, where you're actually going to create them in a grid and lay them out appropriately. So that's your task for today. I hope you have a good experience with that, and I'll be here to help you out. But yeah, get out a piece of paper and write, plan these things out. Think about how this is going to work. I'm not here. I don't want to steal away the chance to do this interesting thinking from you. But I'll be here to help you when you get stuck, for sure. Okay. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.